So, not sure how you found us today, but we are delighted to be here with you for the first episode of the six-part mini-series. The first thing I want to do is introduce the main person in this show and in this mini-series, which is Louis Sr. So, Louis, do you want to tell us a little bit about who you are and about yourself?
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, let me say, Laura, thank you for being part of this with me. I'll give you a little bit of background.
Sure.
As you say, my name is Louis. I was born in Leeds in 1951 and got out of there in my late teens and finished off working in the oil field. And that's really going to be the crux of what I want to talk about. Interestingly enough, my wife is Spanish, been married for over 45 years. You are my daughter, as you well know.
Yes.
And I have the privilege of having a son, David, as well. And we have some lovely grandchildren, who I'm sure we'll talk about later.
So let's kick off, and again we'll get into a little bit of the focus and the history behind why you decided to do this. But do you want to share with our audience a little bit about why you asked me specifically to be the one to interview you?
Well, I think we've had the privilege of working together for a long, long time, and I will never forget one time when we were on one of the oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. At a break, I think you said to me, you need to stop telling war stories. And I said, Laura, what's a war story? He said, when I've heard it 3 times. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in these podcasts, you have heard before, but a lot of people won't. And that's really why I wanted to get you involved.
My aim of being the interviewer and host for these podcasts, for this series, is actually to get to some stuff that I may have not heard before. So
that is quite possible.
Hopefully, we'll find the right moments to dig a little deeper. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about basically, who we are, or I'm your daughter. We're going in this journey together. Can you tell me a little bit about why do this particular focus in terms of your journey in the oil and gas industry, and why now?
Why now? There's a lot of people who I know, and you know some of them very well, who keep reminding me that my runway is not getting any longer, which is true. And there are things that I've learned along the way that I really would love to share with people. And interestingly enough, a few weeks ago when I was in Luanda, I was having dinner with a mutual friend and client of ours, and he said to me, Louis, I've known you for years, and now that you're telling me these stories, why have you never told me them before? And he said, you need, again, somebody who likes to tell people what to do, like yourself, he said, you really need to tell these stories. So I wanted to make sure that over the 6 episodes that we're going to do, there's a kind of timeline in terms of the journey, and there's some great leadership lessons along the way. So hopefully it's a win-win for everybody.
So you've told people a little bit about where you grew up and when you were born, but maybe just to set the scene, tell us what you do professionally and what you have dedicated, maybe not the earlier piece, which we'll get into in a lot more detail, but tell us what you do professionally today.
I have the privilege of being the CEO of an organization called Equilibria, which we founded in 2004. So literally the other day was our 21st anniversary. When we first got together with 3 co-founders, I'll talk about later on, one afternoon we sat down, we came up with a vision of realizing potential and a core value of people first. And everything that we do today, and a lot of what I want to talk about over the next few series that we do, is very much around that. The business of realizing potential is something that I really take to heart. And when I think about the people who are continually encouraging me to share our stories with more people, that's really the foundation.
So we'll get to that piece quite a bit later on, probably around episode 4 or 5. But first, we really need to build a foundation for people to understand the journey that you have been on, which is, I think, very interesting and extremely significant. So let's kind of dive into the main, you could say, part of what we're discussing on this first episode, which is the beginning of your journey in the oil and gas industry. So help us set the scene a little bit here. So what year did you go offshore? How old were you? How did all of that come about? Maybe just tell us a little bit about that initial, how you got there.
Yeah. I had actually was looking to go into into a scaffolding business. And my father, with great wisdom, said, if you're going to start a scaffolding business, you better go to learn how to scaffold, which is very good advice when you think about it. Having never touched anything heavier than a tennis racket in my entire life before that, it was quite a journey, I can tell you. And interesting enough, I met some fabulous people. The coal mines had all shut down by the time I got into the scaffolding business. So most of the people I worked with were miners, happy to come out of the ground and work in the fresh air. Some wonderful, wonderful people. They realized very quickly that I was never going to be a great scaffolder, but I was actually quite good with numbers, funnily enough. And so the foreman said to me, Lewis, what we'll do is I'll teach you my job in how to price a scaffolding job, and I'll do the heavy lifting for you, basically. And I've got you back, which served me very well, actually. The first thing we ever did was actually the Yorkshire Post building, or the new building in Leeds, and then actually went up to York Minster, which actually was sinking at the time. Very, very interesting. And not long after we started that job, this guy came up to me and he said, hey, would you like to go offshore onto a rig that's going to need some scaffolding? And I went, what's a rig? I mean, nobody in those days had a clue what an oil rig was.
Just before we go to that, I'm really curious though, how old were you when you were kind of starting to get into the scaffolding business?
23.
Okay, so you were 23 years old, had never seen an oil rig or been exposed to any of that.
No.
How long were you doing the scaffolding before they asked about?
About a year.
Okay, so a year into it.
A year. So I had a bit of an understanding, but no great understanding, and certainly it proved my incompetence. But again, worked with some really I was thinking of the names, some people that I remember back then, and some truly wonderful human beings. Again, what was funny, if you think about it, these guys were pretty strong guys, obviously. Again, they'd been working in the mines. When we were working in tall buildings, I used to get the lift or the elevator to come down. They would just go to the end of each section and do free fall, drop to the next section like acrobats all the way down. Anyhow, we finished off going out to a platform that was actually being, I want to say it was called the Trans World 58 or 59. I can't remember which one. But we went out to this platform to actually do some scaffolding and to price for a much larger job. And we got out there they said, oh, by the way, you're going to have to sleep in a porter cabin on the helideck. So we weren't even in the main accommodation of the platform. They didn't tell us they were sandblasting the helideck at the time. So every time we literally walked out of the door to work, we were immediately covered in grit from head to toe. And I thought, this is an interesting environment. I've never seen anything like it.
So just to set that scene a little bit more as well, would you say growing up, you grew up in a kind of privileged lifestyle? Like, I know the horseback riding and tennis, so probably not a lot of work with your hands.
No, zero work with my. Like I say, I was actually a pretty good tennis player, and that's probably the heaviest thing I'd ever lifted in my entire life was a couple of tennis rackets.
How did you get offshore on that first trip? Was it by ship or?
No. We got a helicopter, but again, this is there was no training. There was none of the Beaux-Yet things that you have to do today. I can't actually totally remember, but I believe the heliport was a hut in Aberdeen. I'm going back a long time here. And we finished off on this rig. And I remember the moment I fell in love with it. When I knew we were going to be doing this together, I was trying to remember what was the one thing that immediately caught my attention. And I'll never, ever forget it. We got there late in the afternoon. Like I say, we were herded into this porter cabin where they were literally sandblasting around us. And then somebody said, oh, we go for breakfast at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'd never got up at 5 o'clock in the morning my entire life. But I went down into the galley or the eating area on this platform, and I sat next to an American. So this was my very, very first exposure to my very first American. And he was there.
What part of the U.S. was he from?
He was from Texas, as I found out. On his plate, he had a T-bone steak, fried eggs, ice cream, and chewing tobacco. And I'd never seen, but he'd literally taken this lump of chewing tobacco, out of his mouth, plunked it on the plate, ate the fried eggs, ice cream, and the T-bone steak all together,
At
and
5
then
a.m.
back in went the and I said, so you do this every morning? Yeah, I'll do this 3 times a day. And that was the start of a phenomenal journey.
So I wanted to ask also about that first time or first few times being out there. What was the kind of where were people from? Were they mostly Scottish? Was it a mix of people from the north of England and Scotland and the US? What was the kind of mix?
The mix on there, because they were actually converting the platform, I want to say, into a production platform. There were a lot of different skill sets out there, but the one thing that caught my attention, they were all skillful with their hands. So they're either electricians, electronic people, welders, etc., etc., etc. Everybody knew how to do something with their hands other than me, to put it in a nutshell. But very quickly I realized a lot of them were ex-military. The military at the time was probably downsizing, and it was a natural progression for people to come into the industry, in an industry that was very physical at the time. The other side of it was a lot of people doing deep sea diving. Mm-hmm. And again, at the beginning, the divers that knew what they were doing were ex-Navy divers. Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of divers lost their lives because very quickly, as the need for decompression diving became more prevalent, people were going on 6-week courses to learn how to be a diver. And I don't know how many times later on I would sit in the galley talking to somebody and go, oh, this is going to be my last dive. And it most certainly was.
Actually, interestingly enough, I was listening to another podcast the other day that they were talking about an incident that happened not too long ago with diving in the North Sea in Norway.
The last breath?
Yeah, I think it was a dolphin operation or something like that. Anyway, but the point is that diving to this day, I think, is one of the most dangerous jobs that you can do out there.
Very much.
So even with that kind of risk factor and everything else, it attracted you. What was the one thing, other than the large meal portions, that really kind of hooked you to want to be in the industry? And what hooked you to want to be a part of it? So
to put it in perspective, we probably spent about no more than a week or 10 days out there for the very first time, and we were just on the periphery of everything else that was going on. But I began to see the camaraderie. I began to see people willing to teach. I think was very, very startling to me. Very, very, very open. And again, you've been around as many Americans as I have over the years. People who really enjoyed doing what they were doing and very willing to share their lives very, very quickly.
So they may not call it mentoring then, but they were mentoring people.
Absolutely. There's a lot of that going on. And it wasn't called anything, mentoring or coaching or whatever, but there was a lot of that going on and very necessary. So basically, after we got off, as we were leaving the platform, I went and asked people, how do you get a job on one of these things? Yeah. And they said, oh, you go to the biggest drilling contractor in Aberdeen and, bang on the door and they'll give you a job, because they were bringing in rig after rig after rig. So I did that.
Was that during a boom then?
Yeah.
You entered the industry?
Oh, yeah, very much. This is in the mid-70s. I mean, everything was booming. And there are a lot of people who hadn't got a clue what they were doing, as I began to learn very quickly.
So before you tell us about your first few years out there in the North Sea, which we'll go to next, what was your parents' reaction when you came home and said, that's it, I'm leaving the scaffolding business and I'm going to work offshore, like I'm going to make a career out of this? What did they say?
Are you mad? Well, the first question was, I said I'm going to work on it. Well, back up, when I was first going out to this platform, I called my mum and said, hey, I'm going on the helicopter to this platform. No, you're not. I said, yeah, I am. It's something I really want to do. And I'll never forget what she said. She said, if it makes you happy, you go. Oh. But then as time went on, I learned something really interesting, which I heard over and over again. The oil business is a very, very difficult business to get into. And it's even harder to get out of. And here we are 50 odd years later, and we're still involved to a degree in the same business. But no, once they realized that it was something that I'd be happy doing, as long as I was happy, my mum and dad were fine with it. They didn't know the risk. I don't think anybody, it hadn't filtered down to Leeds anything about oil rigs. So.
Yeah, people would probably be aware of what was going on in the coal mines, but it just wasn't,
exactly.
It wasn't enough.
Exactly.
So tell us about those first few years, getting started, first company. What was that start of that journey like?
It was interesting. I went to work with a drilling contractor who had a very good reputation. Really, really enjoyed working out there. Again, like I say, there were a lot of people coming in from the military. So, and I started unless you came in as a professional, whatever, be it electrician, etc., you started off as a painter, not even a roustabout. And I was a terrible painter. In fact, I'll never forget, these things come back now, but they gave me, they had Caterpillar engines on the rig, which is a brand of very brightly painted engines. And I was told to go in and repaint this engine. And I dropped the tin of paint all over the generator part of the engine.
Was it yellow?
It was yellow, and they were not happy with me at all. But thank goodness, the attitude in those days was, you'll learn from your mess-ups, because everybody makes mistakes. Today you talk about human error is normal. Trust me, in those days, it was very normal. So they basically said, well, you're obviously not very good as a painter, so we'll promote you to what they call a roustabout. So I became a roustabout. And again, as I say, I've been thinking about this as we're talking. I made a terrible mistake one night, which I've not talked about probably for anybody, but I distinctly remember. So somewhere between what they call a roustabout and a roughneck, there's this position where you look after what they call the sack room, which you know what the sack room is, where all of the materials that make up the mud or the fluid that you use in the hole to bring out the cuttings when you're drilling. And on these particular rigs, in their brilliance, when they designed these rigs, they had this massive area where they didn't have any drains, basically. So my job every night was to clean this whole area, which was impossible to keep very clean. They had a Venturi system and like a suction system. So you basically spent half the night scrubbing, then pushed all the stuff into the corner, and hopefully this suction system would put it all out. And it didn't work. So in my wisdom, one night I went and taught the welder, who didn't know anything more than I did. He'd have just started offshore. I said, can you just cut a hole here?
Oh, God.
And hey, the next morning, I can still remember his name, the tool pusher came out, C.L. Sims, American guy. And he's walking around, morning, Lewis. I said, hey, come on, I want to show you something. And I had this place immaculate. I said, what do you think to that? He goes, how did you do that? I said, look. And you go, and there's a hole, and there was the North Sea right below. I said, my God, this is a main structure. They had to get the DNV out, and oh God, it was a mess. Again, they said, Lewis, you can't just tell the welder to cut holes. Again, no permit to work.
You think your influence skills were showing up at that time?
Started to.
Yeah.
And I felt sorry for the welder because he should have known better. Apparently, I had. But again, this was life in those days. So.
In the early days, I'm curious. In the very early days, let's say in the first year or year and a half of you being out there, did you witness any incidents, or were you kind of aware of the risk that you were in?
The risk became very, very obvious. That there were several people hurt, maimed, and killed, and that really, really got to my attention. Obviously. Yeah. And again, some of it was the divers, because they did the deep decompression side of things was just not very clear to a lot of people. But also there's a lot of physical activity, as you well know. And in those days, a lot less automation, obviously, than there is today. So if you get caught between something, and why they ever call them pinch points is beyond me. You don't get pinched, you get crushed.
Yeah.
And there was lots of that going on. I worked out pretty quick that if you wanted to get promoted from roustabout to roughneck, you just stood at near where the drill floor was. And an American told me, he says, Lewis, it's a lot easier to squeegee than pretend to squeegee.
Yeah. You
know what a squeegee is, right?
Yes.
So I did a lot of pretending to squeegee, and then eventually you'd hear this bang crash, somebody get hurt, and then this head would appear from the rig floor, you up here, and then that's, you were the next one in line. So did I witness things? Yes. Did I often wonder why people put themselves at risk the way they did? That story will come much later, as you well know, from a personality perspective. Yeah. But there's something that I will never, ever forget to put things in perspective for you. We all worked for a driller who was a Canadian guy, and this guy shouted and screamed at us 12 hours a day. And in fact, so because he shouted all the time, it kind of went over everybody's head because that's what he did.
Yeah.
He used to keep different tools in his area where he drilled, so he could throw them at us if he was getting really
I was going to be my next question. Did he ever throw anything?
Oh, he threw the slips at us quite often. But what was the point of the whole thing was so funny. He ran into the crown one day. So literally, you have a travelling block which picks up the pipe. And one night, for whatever reason, he went too fast, too hard, and he actually hit the crown, which is not a good thing. Thank goodness nobody got hurt, or there wasn't much damage. But the story got out pretty quick. So we were working 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off. And, like you see all these penguins that are on the news right now. That's how we walked. When we got off the helicopter to go to the hut, when we finished our 2 weeks, we all would go single file after him, the big man, the driller, right? So he's first, then the assistant driller, then the derrickman, and then there's the roughneck. And there is his wife standing in the doorway of this hut, who used to be his derrickman in Canada, standing there with a hand on her hip. She goes, "You useless son of a bitch. You never could run a rig as well as I could." So she was actually giving him hell because she'd heard the story. So when we all went back to work, his name was Glenn Wasson. Glenn, you can shout at us all day long. Now we understand
why you shouted.
Why you shouted at us. But that was the kind of atmosphere. It was an amazing, amazing time for people.
So did you ever get hurt in that kind of early time? Or significantly, other than like a scrape or a bruise or something?
No, I was lucky in that respect. I don't remember ever getting hurt. I did get hurt a couple of times later on, but always through the same thing, which again I'll talk about later. But it was the camaraderie. I go back to that. So I wasn't a very good roustabout, especially having cut this off. So they promoted me to roughneck. So now I was the only person on the crew at one point who wasn't a family member of this all ex-butchers, the whole crew, and me. And again, they all had right arms as butchers, like the Hulk. But I worked with them for a long time, and it was really interesting because they really wanted to get overseas. The key was always to go overseas because that's where the big money was, right?
Yeah.
So the whole crew got offered a job in Kuwait, and I said to my mum and dad, the whole crew's going to Kuwait. What do you think? They said, well, a lot of sand there. It's really hot. Maybe you want to hang on because there's lots of opportunities coming up.
Huge contrast then from the North Sea. So most of that crew was going from the North Sea. And again, for the audience, maybe to describe, maybe tell us a little bit about what it's like out there, since, a lot of people may not have had the experience of, being either on a ship or on a platform or anything like that in the North Sea. Tell us a little bit about the weather and, the kind of environment that you were in.
So you talk about getting hurt. I will tell you, the weather can be very, very nice. It can be super calm and you think, everything is rosy and lovely. And other days, the weather is horrendous. Absolutely. I mean, you hear these exaggerated stories, but I've seen it. I've seen waves coming over the helideck, so it's not comfortable, to put it lightly. But I will tell you, there was one particular hitch which sticks in my mind where not only was it bad weather, but it was really foggy. And so the helicopters couldn't come out. And which meant we'd not only worked our 2 weeks, but we now had to work maybe, 6 or 7 days. And then they actually started bringing people out on supply boats. And again, the rest of the crew said, we're going to go in on the boat. Are you coming, Lewis? I don't do very well on boats. Yeah, but we're going, how bad can it be? How bad can it be? If somebody had given me a gun, I would have blown my head off on this trip back. And it probably took a good 24 hours to get back in and we're on our way out. Oh God, I never felt so sick in my life ever.
So most of the platforms you were working on were basically
Floating.
steady, right? They
No,
were
no,
like
no, no.
massive
No,
movement.
no, there's some movement. They're floating rigs.
Right.
What they call semi-submersible.
So
What? Sorry, I just want to tell you. So what I was going to tell you before about the camaraderie. Sorry.
Yeah.
So, having not been a great roughneck, they decided to make me the derrickman. So now, again, with my skinny little arms, I'm all the way up in the tower, as you know, derrick as they call it, and you have to pull the pipe in when we're coming out the hole. If I think about the things that today about safety and all the rest of it, we had open radiators up in the derrick just to keep warm, and used to smoke like chimneys up there. I mean, you can imagine that today, but never going to happen. But I physically could not do this pipe on my own. I tried as hard as I could. It just wasn't in me. But I had some really good friends who worked on the deck. So they were, and I could Steve Roberts, bless his heart, I don't know if he's still alive or not. He was the crane operator. Any time that he wasn't busy, he would climb up and help me to pull the pipe back. So
you made friends quickly.
Very quickly. And that's one thing that the bosses on the rig kept saying, Lewis, you have an amazing affinity with people. Because a lot of the people out there were technically competent and not very good with other people.
No.
So where they tended to be able to translate very quickly from their brain to their fingers, I could translate from my brain to my tongue and not much further.
Yeah.
But it really kind of literally stood me apart.
I can imagine so, because if you think, I mean, I'm putting myself in people's shoes back then without a lot of information. Who would pick to go and isolate themselves for several weeks at a time? Maybe it wouldn't be your most people-oriented people. So.
Or try sleeping below, because you've got boats in the room.
Yeah.
One of the guys I slept underneath, he had DTs. He put his head right through the blooming roof one night, just coming up alcohol poisoning. I mean, it was a real mixed bag of people that were going out there, and some of them probably didn't last long, and other people thrived in it.
Is there still people from back then that now that are still alive and that you are in contact with from all the way back then?
So on Friday, as I mentioned, was our 21st anniversary. Yesterday, the OEUK actually featured me on a news article, and a guy wrote to me last night. He said, "Lewis, I remember when you were on the break." So this is when I was a driller. So yes, there are a few people, thank goodness, who are still around and still alive, and they've all got bad memories like me, so they remember the funny bits and not some of the crazy stuff we get up to. I went back to the North Sea years later.
Before you go to that, when did you leave the North Sea? What year was that?
Probably about 78.
So you spent
about 3 or 4 years
before leaving the North Sea?
And then I got the opportunity of a lifetime. And it all happened because I was working up in the derrick, and they got stuck. When you're drilling sometimes, you can actually get stuck in the hole. So the other crew, so 12 hours on, 12 hours off. So they fished for 12 hours. In other words, they were trying to fish out with different tools what was stuck in the hole. Our 12 hours, we had to keep pulling the pipe out of the hole and putting the pipe back in. And this time I'm a derrickman. And it was freezing. I mean, I've never been so cold in my entire life, and just really suffering. You keep the T-bone steaks, I've had enough. So I literally got home, and the company called me, and they said, "Hey, the rest of your crew went to Kuwait. Would you like to go to Japan? We're building a new drill ship."
Wow.
And I said, "Is it hot there?" That was my only question. And they said, "Yeah, I suppose so." I said, "Well, I'm your man." So, and again, you think about how crazy it is. They flew me to London.
Wow.
They picked me up in a black limo at Heathrow Airport to be interviewed. I was interviewed, got the visa for Japan.
And you were the derrickman.
I was a derrickman.
Wow. So in those first 4 years, would you say you had 1, 2, 3, 4 promotions basically?
Yeah.
Up to then, so obviously it was a very dynamic industry at the time, and you did make a few mistakes along the way.
Several mistakes along the way. Yeah.
Still managed to kind of get to that next step.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to share with the audience about those first 4 years in the North Sea and how that shaped your journey before leaving to Japan?
I was very lucky that there was a vice president of the drilling contract I worked for who kind of took a shine to me, and he gave me a lot of opportunities that most people probably wouldn't get. But the thing that really stuck with me more than anything was, even back then, I was determined to find a way to help people go home in one piece and not get themselves hurt. And then I left the North Sea, and I never thought I'd go back. And then a few years later, there was a downturn, and I got the opportunity to go back and actually do a well from start to finish. And I'm only smiling when I'm saying this because I decided to do the whole well. So rather than go for 2 weeks, I think I went out for about 3 months. This was around the time you were born, maybe just before you were born. I had so what I told them was, anytime I'll do my 12 hours, I want to do it as a driller.
Yep.
I'd already become an OIM, an offshore installation manager. I wanted to be on the rig floor doing the actual drilling to understand every bit of what was going on, because technology had moved on considerably. And if I was in bed when they were doing something I hadn't seen before, come and wake me up, and I want to be there.
What was the motivation behind that kind of determination to see the full well through?
I wanted to be able to understand it, to be able to work on, because there's different forms of drilling rigs, be it land rig, drill ship, etc. And this was a pretty modern semi-submersible that I hadn't had much exposure to. But I love people. So after lunch every day, as a driller, and as a driller, in those days, there was no seats and all of the stuff you get today. I used to stand there 12 hours a day drilling and never move more than about 2 square feet other than go for lunch. So I would have Mars bar and Coca-Cola parties in the drill shack. And I was probably on there, I'd say 2.5, 3 months. I left the rig. I went on the rig at about 75 kilos, and I walked off. I got off the rig weighing 97 kilos.
Wow.
And your mother was standing at the airport in Alicante. She said, "Louis, you've finally done it. You've become obese. Well done."
The Mars bar party.
The Mars bar party was something else, yeah.
So, before we kind of start wrapping up this first piece of the journey in the North Sea, I know sometimes you have shared with me that initially something that was quite challenging at the beginning was the mindset of people and how different that was than overseas in different places. How do you see that looking back now in terms of the mindset of people that you still were able to kind of overcome somehow to connect with them?
It's a really good question. Again, these are all pretty possible memories now, but I just remember people being. There were some very tough characters out there, and a lot of people, as I say, were ex-military, so they were very, very structured in the way that they did things. And as you well know, you know me well, I'm not the most structured human being in the world. So I was such an anomaly to most people. It was almost like they took a shine to me and kind of looked after me, and probably the best way to put it. And it served me well. There's no two ways about it. But if I go back to why do I do what I do? I mean, I'm 73 years old right now.
Yeah.
And why do I want to share all the lessons that we've learned over the years? Because I think so many people can benefit. And you hear a lot about it today, particularly post-COVID, and then you've got all of the, all of the way that people use phones and iPhones every day. Communication is so important. And if there's nothing else I learned then, it was how to communicate with people from completely different backgrounds, completely different walks of life than myself, and find common ground. And I think that was a good lesson for me.
So, since this was the earlier part of your career in oil and gas, and since we will have, I'm sure, a big variety of people listening to this, what would you say to people who are starting off their career in an industry that might be unknown to them, be it oil and gas or be it any other industry? Those first few years where you really kind of get to build a foundation of where you're going, what would be your advice if you think back of your first few years, what would be your advice to people starting off in any kind of, let's say, higher risk or more industrial industry today?
Find your passion, find what drives you, and know it's okay to go, this is not for me. So let me jump forward a few years to kind of put that in perspective for you. When we first started, not long after we started Equilibria, one of the people I had worked for back in those days that you're talking about actually called me up and he said, Lewis, I am running 2 rigs in Australia and I'm really worried. The safety culture is worse than I've ever been anywhere else. Would you please get one of your coaches, but you come yourself. I need you here to kind of lay things out for people. So we went out to this rig in Australia, where I know Ian Collins. You know Ian Collins. We met him there. And the OIM, the offshore installation manager, was a great big Polish guy. I mean, this guy was like 6'8" and scared everybody that he walked past. And we went out for the first hitch, and I very quickly began to see that indeed it was probably the most dangerous set of behaviors I'd seen in a long time. And I walked into the recreation room one afternoon just to get a glass of water or something, and there was a kid sitting on the sofa crying his eyes out. I say kid,
Wow.
somebody probably early 20s. So I said, what's up? He said, well, I came out here because I really wanted to try this offshore life. And he was working in the galley. It wasn't like he was in any of the high risk part of it, but he said, it's not for me. I hate it. I'm so scared. I said, listen, go and see the boss. Was not the gentleman, the big Polish guy, was actually his relief.
Yeah.
So go and see the boss, tell him you want to get a helicopter and you want to go home. And there's nothing wrong with that. Oh, I don't know if I said, listen, I'll come with you. So I walk him up there, we sit down together, cut a long story short, next morning, he's off on the helicopter. I never thought anything more about it. Until the next time, Norman, who you know well, the other coach and I, we go back to this rig and a month later, and as we're coming down the steps off the helicopter, here is this big Polish offshore installation manager. Who's Louis Senior? I said, I am. He said, you in my office. I said, oh my goodness, what's up?
Louis.
Who is Louis? I said, I am Louis. He said, and he closed the door. He goes, come here. And I go, what? And he gives me a big hug.
Oh,
he said, that was my son.
No way.
And he said, I told his mother he wasn't cut out to come and work on a rig. Thank you, because I could not have done what you did.
No way.
And so when you go back to, as I say, it's the offshore life is not for everybody. And if you think about the changes in the energy industry today, there's people going to work out on windmills, on the road. It's not for everybody. So if it's something that you can love to do, go for it. And if you don't love it, get out of there. Yeah. That's my advice.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for walking us through these first few years in your journey. I knew I was going to learn some new stuff, and I did today. And I know that I'm sure people listening to this will have enjoyed getting to know you a little bit better. On our next episode, we're going to be talking about this exciting trip to Japan and getting to find out a little bit more about the next step in the journey. What would you like to leave people with in terms of what's coming up, that so they know why they would want to come back for the next few episodes?
I would like people to come back because I have to say that where we're at today, I don't do anything without intentionality. I had no idea even what the word meant that many years ago. But what you will gain from the stories that we're going to be talking about here are things that can set you up for life.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Looking forward to the next one.
Thank you.